Have you ever lived a life so predictable it felt like a script? Wake up. Work. Go home. Repeat. She had. Day after day, she moved through the hospital halls like a shadow, unnoticed, unmissed. Until he walked in. A new presence. A shift in the air. A man with eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully built walls. But what happens when something, or someone, you never expected suddenly feels necessary? And worse. What if it was never meant to last? Stay. This story is just beginning. Ivy Quinn had forgotten what it felt like to be anything but tired. Her days blurred into one another, early mornings filled with the sterile scent of antiseptic, long hours spent under the relentless glow of hospital lights, and nights too short to dream. At 25, she was a skilled and compassionate nurse, dedicated to her patients, admired by colleagues for her quiet efficiency. But outside of work, there was nothing. No dates. No spontaneous weekend getaways. No late-night conversations over glasses of wine. Instead, there was a tiny house in a sleepy village, a mother who depended on her, and a life that felt more like an obligation than a choice. She had accepted it. Routine was safe. Loneliness was predictable. Then he arrived. Dr. Knox Wilder swept into the hospital like a breath of fresh air, 28, confident, with a smile that made the air feel warmer and eyes so piercingly blue they seemed to cut through the haze of monotony. He was the kind of man women noticed. And they did. The nurses whispered about him in break rooms, stealing glances when they thought he wasn't looking. He was charming, professional, effortlessly kind. The kind of man who made the world feel a little brighter. But not for Ivy. Men like him didn't see women like her. At least, that's what she thought. Until one day, she caught him looking. And he didn't look away. At first, Ivy thought it was a coincidence. The way Knox always seemed to find her in the crowded hospital hallways. The way his gaze lingered a second too long, like he was searching for something beneath her carefully composed exterior. Then came the conversations, small at first, just polite exchanges in passing. But soon, they became something more. Did you get any sleep last night? You always take the hardest shifts, don't you? You should eat something, Quinn. You can't take care of everyone else if you don't take care of yourself. He made it sound so casual, like he wasn't unraveling her with every word. And then, the coincidences became intentional. Knox started showing up beside her in the break room, a cup of coffee in hand, always exactly the way she liked it, even though she had never told him. He found reasons to walk with her after their shifts, making easy conversation, as if he had nowhere better to be. And when it rained one evening, he insisted on driving her home, brushing off her protests with a lopsided grin. I'd rather not have to treat you for pneumonia next week. His presence was warm, effortless, and dangerously close to feeling necessary. Ivy told herself it was nothing. He was kind to everyone. But then one night, under the two bright lights of the hospital, he leaned against the nurse's station and said, almost too casually, "Let me take you to a movie this weekend." She blinked. Him? Asking her. Like? A date, she asked, instantly regretting how unsure she sounded. Knox tilted his head, studying her. Like two people who could probably use a night off. No pressure, Quinn. Just say yes. And against every cautious instinct, she did. The night of the movie felt like stepping into someone else's life. For the first time in years, Ivy wasn't just a nurse or a daughter, she was a woman, laughing at stupid jokes over a bucket of popcorn, walking beside a man who made the world feel a little less heavy. After the movie, they strolled through quiet streets, their hands brushing just enough to make her pulse quicken. They talked, really talked. About childhood dreams, about fears, about things neither of them had admitted out loud in years. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ivy felt seen. By the time he walked her to her door, something unfamiliar bloomed in her chest, hope. She wanted more. Then, everything shattered. Days later, on a night thick with rain, Knox called her. His voice was different this time. Heavy. "I need to see you," he said. "There's something I have to tell you." The urgency in his tone sent ice down her spine. They met at a quiet cafe, but Knox didn't sit. He stood by the window, his back tense, his fingers running through damp hair. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he said, voice tight. "I never meant for this to happen." Ivy's stomach twisted. "Knox, what's going on?" He exhaled sharply, then turned to face her. His eyes, those same blue eyes that had looked at her like she was someone, were filled with something raw. Something broken. "I'm married." The words landed like a slap. Ivy felt the blood drain from her face, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered. "No, you. You would have said something. You wouldn't have." "It's complicated," Knox interrupted, his jaw tight. "I swear to you, Ivy, it's not what you think." But it was, wasn't it? She had felt it. The pull between them, the way he looked at her, the way he made her believe she was special. And the entire time, he had belonged to someone else. "You should have told me." Her voice barely held together. Knox took a step closer, but she recoiled. "I wanted to," he said. "But I was afraid you'd walk away." "And he broke off, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter now." He turned before she could say anything else. Walked out into the rain. Gone. Leaving her alone with nothing but the storm inside her chest. The world had felt dull since that night. Days passed in a blur of routines. Ivy threw herself into work, hoping exhaustion would drown out the ache in her chest. But it didn't. No amount of late shifts or sleepless nights could erase the sound of Knox's voice, the way he had looked at her when he confessed. "I'm married." She should hate him. She wanted to hate him. And yet, some foolish part of her still searched for him in the hospital hallways. But Knox had disappeared, no stolen glances, no quiet conversations. Just absence. Maybe it was for the best. Or maybe that was the lie she told herself. Then, she saw him. It was supposed to be a simple grocery run. Ivy had been absent-mindedly reaching for a carton of milk when a familiar voice cut through the quiet hum of the store. "Knox." Her heart stopped. She turned, her breath lodging in her throat. He was there. With her. The woman standing beside him was breathtaking, tall, poised, effortlessly beautiful. Long, chestnut hair cascaded over her shoulders, her movements graceful, polished. She laughed at something Knox said, the sound light and easy. And worst of all, he laughed with her. Ivy stood frozen, the carton of milk slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. Neither of them noticed. They were too lost in their own world, walking side by side, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. Like a man in love. Like a man happy in his marriage. The betrayal hit harder than she expected. Had he lied to her about everything? The way he had looked at her, had it all been some cruel game? He had made her feel something, made her believe there was something real between them. And now, here he was, playing the part of the devoted husband without a single trace of hesitation. Ivy's chest tightened. She needed to get out. She turned on her heel and walked away, her pulse hammering, her vision blurring at the edges. Had she really been that naive? Had she really let herself fall for a lie? Knox Wilder was nothing more than a mistake. A mistake she would never make again. 3 nights passed. 3 nights of lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene at the grocery store over and over. Knox and Laura. Their laughter. His hand on her back. Ivy had tried to bury the pain, to convince herself she didn't care. But the truth was cruel, she cared far more than she wanted to admit. So when the knock came at her door that night, sharp and unexpected, her heart leaped into her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She hesitated before opening it, but when she did, her breath hitched. Laura. Standing in the dim porch light, looking just as composed, just as striking as before. But up close, Ivy noticed something different. There was no warmth in her expression, no condescending smirk. Just cold, unreadable eyes. "You're Ivy Quinn, right?" The words sent a chill down Ivy's spine. She gripped the door frame. "Why are you here?" For a moment, Laura didn't answer. Then, with a sigh, she looked past Ivy, as if weighing her next words. "I know about you and Knox." Ivy's stomach twisted. Here it was. The confrontation she had dreaded. "Look, if you came here to. He's dying." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Ivy's breath caught. "What?" Laura's expression didn't change. "Stage 4 cancer. He has months, maybe less." The room tilted. "No. That couldn't be right." "You're lying," Ivy whispered, but her voice trembled. Laura exhaled, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. "He didn't want you to know. That's why he pushed you away. Why he made sure you saw us together." The grocery store. His laughter. "He wanted you to hate him," Laura continued. "Because if you hated him, you wouldn't be there when," she hesitated. "When it happens." Ivy's fingers dug into the door frame. The air felt too thick, too heavy. "You expect me to believe that?" Laura's jaw tightened. "Believe what you want. But Knox is running out of time. And whether you want to or not, you need to decide. Are you going to let him die alone?" Ivy's world cracked. Every piece of anger, every ounce of heartbreak she had carried dissolved into something deeper. Something unbearable. Knox had chosen this pain. To protect her. And she couldn't let him face it alone. Ivy pushed through the hospital doors, her pulse hammering in her ears. The scent of antiseptic filled her lungs, sharp and clinical, as if warning her to turn back. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, as she walked down the stark white hallway. Room 317. That was where he was. That was where he had been hiding. She reached the door and hesitated. Through the small window, she could see him, Knox Wilder, the man who had turned her world upside down. He sat by the window, staring blankly at the city lights beyond the glass. He looked smaller somehow, his broad shoulders a little less broad, his skin paler than she remembered. But it was still him. And God, she hated him for what he had done. Not for being sick. Not for keeping secrets. But for thinking he could decide for her, for walking away and expecting her to do the same. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped inside. Knox turned at the sound of the door clicking shut, and for a brief second, something flashed across his face, shock, guilt, maybe even relief. But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened into something unreadable. "What are you doing here?" His voice was hoarse, rough around the edges. Ivy felt something inside her snap. "You really thought I would just hate you and move on?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Knox exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked exhausted, more exhausted than she had ever seen him. "Ivy." Go home. No. She took a step closer. I'm not leaving. His jaw clenched. He looked away, shaking his head. I don't want you to see me like this, he muttered. You don't understand. I need you to have a better life, a life without you. Ivy cut in, her voice fierce. That's not your choice to make. Knox squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulders heaving with the weight of unspoken words. He exhaled shakily. I don't want you to watch me fall apart. Ivy's chest ached. Then don't, she whispered. Let me hold you together. Silence stretched between them. And then, something broke. Knox's shoulders slumped, his breathing uneven. A single tear slipped down his cheek, and when he opened his eyes again, the mask was gone. I can't be selfish and keep you here, he choked out. Ivy reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. And I can't be selfish and let you go. For the first time, he didn't push her away. For the first time, he let himself hold on. Knox's grip on Ivy's hand tightened, as if he was afraid she would disappear. But she stayed. She chose to stay. No more lies. No more pretending. Are you sure about this? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ivy smiled through the tears glistening in her eyes. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. She lifted his trembling hand and pressed it against her cheek, letting him feel the warmth of her skin, the steady beat of her heart, proof that she was here, alive, and not leaving. Then we fight together, he murmured. The days that followed were filled with battles. Hospital visits, new treatments, endless tests. Some days were good, filled with laughter, soft whispers, stolen moments of peace. Others were brutal, pain, exhaustion, the kind of suffering that made Ivy's heart ache. But she never left his side. And neither did he. Hope was a fragile thing, flickering like a candle in the wind. But it was there, in the way Knox smiled at her when she walked into the room. In the way he squeezed her hand before every doctor's visit. In the way he whispered, I love you, every night, as if afraid he wouldn't get another chance. They didn't know what the future held. But they had now. And that was enough. One evening, as they sat together on the hospital bed, Knox rested his head against Ivy's shoulder. The city lights flickered outside, casting a soft glow into the room. I used to think love was about holding on, he murmured. That the strongest thing you could do was let go for someone else's sake. Ivy ran her fingers through his hair, her voice gentle. And now? Knox smiled, a real, genuine smile. Now I know the strongest thing you can do is stay. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, holding him close. Then stay with me. And he did. For however long they had left, he stayed. Because love wasn't about how much time they had, it was about what they did with it. And theirs was a love that would never fade.